The air in my home office was still, tasting of old paper and the low electric hum of diligence. It was 2 a.m. Outside, the Atlanta night was a soft, humid blanket, but in my small room, the only climate was the cold, dry reality of a 12-year-old document. The binder was navy blue, the kind you buy from an office supply store, unremarkable in every way except that it contained the entire architecture of my marriage. I ran my thumb over the plastic cover, the surface cool and smooth, a stark contrast to the tremor in my hand. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. My lawyer had simply asked for a copy of the prenuptial agreement, and in the process of scanning its pages, I had started to read, "My name is Imani. I am 39 years old. For the last 12 years, I had been the wife of Darren, who was now 41. In my professional life, I am a contract manager. I live in a world of clauses, addendums, and liability shields. I negotiate terms, I assess risk, and I ensure that what is promised on paper is what is delivered in practice. A contract, to me, is not a suggestion. It is a blueprint for reality. It is the language 2 parties use to build something together, a shared map for navigating the future. I had always believed a marriage was the most significant contract of all. Not because of its legal standing, but because of the depth of its unwritten clauses, the assumptions of trust, the articles of faith, the covenant of mutual care. I was about to learn that for Darren, a contract was not a map to be followed, but a boundary to be tested. The inciting wound didn't come from a place of anger. It was delivered with the casual, almost bored cruelty of a man who believes he holds all the leverage. We were in the kitchen, the one I'd had remodeled with the bonus I'd earned from closing the largest deal in my company's history. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. We had finally admitted the marriage was over, and the conversation had turned to the mechanics of separation. He was leaning against the marble countertop, a cup of coffee held loosely in his hand, the very picture of unconcerned authority. He had been talking for several minutes, a monologue prepared for him by his new, aggressive lawyer. It was full of phrases like equitable distribution and marital assets, but the tone was anything but equitable. It was a performance of power, a declaration of his perceived victory. I was quiet, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, a sound that had been the backdrop to our entire life together. When he finished his speech, he looked at me, expecting, I think, for me to argue or to cry. I did neither. I just watched him. A small dismissive smile played on his lips. "Look, Imani," he said, setting his mug down with a soft click. "It's simple. I built my business during this marriage. You were a salaried employee. The courts will see that." He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement fill the space between us. Then came the words that fractured everything. "You signed what I put in front of you back then. It was just a formality. You'll walk away with nothing." He said it so easily. "You signed what I put in front of you," as if I were a child, a clerical assistant, a person without agency or expertise. As if the document we both signed, before 2 lawyers, was something he had dictated and I had merely obeyed. He had forgotten who I was. He had forgotten what I do for a living. In that moment, he erased my entire career, my entire intellect, and reduced me to a signature on a page he controlled. He didn't realize that the signature was the one thing that held more power than all his bluster. He thought the story was about his business. He didn't understand that the story was, and always had been, about the contract. To understand why those words landed with the force of a tectonic shift, you have to understand the geology of our marriage. You have to perform an archaeology of disrespect, digging through the layers of accumulated slights and unacknowledged labor that form the bedrock of our life together. The specific erosion in our marriage was professional. I, the contract manager, had become the unpaid risk officer for Darren's ambitions. It started innocently, as these things always do. Early in our marriage, Darren left his corporate job to start a small marketing consultancy. He was brilliant at the creative side, the pitches, the branding, the vision. He was charismatic and convincing, a natural salesman. But the administrative side, the part that turns vision into a viable business, was his kryptonite. He found contracts boring, negotiations tedious, and deadlines insulting. The first time he asked for my help, it felt like an act of love. We were at our small dining table, takeout boxes scattered around us. He slid a vendor agreement across the table. "Babe, can you just glance at this? My eyes are glazing over." I did more than glance. I took out my red pen, the one I used at work, and I went through it, line by line. I found a termination clause that would have allowed the client to walk away with all the intellectual property he'd developed, for any reason, with only 7 days' notice. I found an indemnity clause so broad it would have made him personally liable for any legal action taken against the client related to the campaign. I flagged them, explained the risks in simple terms, and drafted 2 new paragraphs of revised language for him to send back. He was astonished and deeply grateful. "Imani, you're a lifesaver. I would have just signed that." He kissed me, his relief palpable. That night, I felt like a true partner. We were a team. He was the brilliant artist. I was the guardian of his art. It felt good. My expertise was a gift I could give him, a way to build our shared future. For the first few years, this was the dynamic. His business grew, and with each new client or contractor, a document would appear on my side of the bed or on the kitchen counter or emailed to my personal account with the subject line, "Quick look?" It was never quick. I reviewed web development agreements, photographer releases, non-disclosure agreements, and office leases. I created a color-coded spreadsheet to track renewal and termination deadlines, with automated reminders sent to both our phones. I built a template for his standard client agreement, with tiered options for liability and payment terms that protected his cash flow. I was the back office, the legal department, the entire operational infrastructure of his growing business. I did this after my own 10-hour days at a demanding job. I did it on weekends, while he was out playing golf with potential clients. I did it without a title, without compensation, without a single line on my resume to show for it. I did it because I loved him, and I believed in what he was building. I thought we were building it together. The erosion was gradual. The gratitude began to thin, replaced by expectation. Lifesaver became, "Thanks, babe." "Thanks, babe," became a silent nod. The silent nod became an absence of acknowledgement altogether. The documents were no longer presented as a request, but as a task. "Hey, the Johnson contract is in your inbox. I need the notes back by morning." There was no "please," no "could you." It was an assignment. I had become an employee in my own marriage, one who worked for free. I remember one specific instance, about 8 years in. He was trying to land a major contract with a national beverage company. It was the deal that would take his consultancy to the next level. The negotiation had been going on for weeks. He was frustrated, on edge. One Friday night, he came home, threw his briefcase on the floor, and slumped onto the sofa. "They're trying to screw me on the net 90 payment terms," he grumbled. "I'll be out of business before I see a dime." I sat next to him. "Okay, let's think," I said, shifting into my work mode. What if we propose a phased delivery? We tie payments to specific milestones. 30% on signing, 30% on delivery of initial concepts, 40% on campaign launch. That way, you're not financing their entire project. His eyes lit up. That's good. That's really good. I spent the next 2 hours drafting the language for the counterproposal, creating a detailed milestone schedule and payment chart. I wrote a script for him with talking points for his call with their procurement department the following Monday. He took my pages of notes, read them over, and said, "Yeah, this should work." He then turned on the TV to watch the game. I was left sitting on the sofa, surrounded by the invisible architecture of the solution I had just built, completely unseen. He got the contract. The deal was lauded in a local Atlanta business journal. The article featured a large, smiling picture of Darren. He was quoted as saying, "In a tough negotiation, you have to get creative with the terms. It's about finding a win-win." My creativity, my terms, my win. There was no mention of me. When I pointed it out, gently, he shrugged. "What did you want me to do? Thank my wife for helping with my homework in the press?" The memory of that celebration dinner, the one where he raised a glass of champagne to my own damn genius, was no longer a happy one. It was contaminated, poisoned by the truth of my erasure. His success made him more confident, and his confidence curdled into arrogance. He started to believe his own press releases. He was the deal-maker, the visionary. He forgot about the woman with the red pen who made sure his visions were legally sound and financially viable. My contributions became so normalized that they were rendered invisible. If I flagged a risk, he'd get irritated. "Are you always this negative? Can't you just be supportive?" If I missed something because I was overwhelmed with my own job, it was my fault. "I thought you were keeping track of this stuff, Imani. This is a mess." I see now, with the painful clarity of hindsight, that I enabled it. In my desire to be a supportive partner, I had allowed myself to become a utility. I had mistaken my competence for a currency of love, but he had only ever treated it as a free resource to be exploited. I was the chief operating officer of our marriage, a role I never formally accepted and for which the compensation was the occasional privilege of his good mood. I had allowed the scope of my work to expand indefinitely without ever renegotiating the terms of my own contract. Then came the lawyer. About a year before the end, as Darren's business became more complex, he retained a high-powered attorney from a downtown firm, a man named Marcus. Marcus was all sharp suits and predatory smiles. He saw every interaction as a battle, every agreement as a territory to be conquered. Darren, already leaning toward arrogance, was mesmerized. He began to parrot Marcus's language. Suddenly, our conversations were peppered with phrases like maximizing leverage, mitigating exposure, and maintaining a dominant position. He was talking about his clients, but the mindset was seeping into our marriage. He started treating our domestic disagreements like contract disputes. He would try to corner me with logic traps, misrepresent my past statements, and frame my emotional responses as unprofessional. He was echoing Marcus. "Marcus says you never give the first number. Marcus says the one who controls the paperwork controls the deal." I once overheard him on the phone with Marcus, talking about a conflict with a contractor, and Darren said, proudly, "I'm just holding her to the letter of the agreement we made." The irony was a physical ache in my chest. He revered the sanctity of contracts with everyone but me. With me, the terms were always provisional, my contributions always assumed. I became a buffer between his ambition and his carelessness. a buffer between his charisma and the fine print that could undo it all, a buffer between his self-perception as a genius and the reality of his operational vulnerabilities. And a buffer, I was coming to realize, is designed to absorb impact. It is designed to be worn down, to be eroded, until there is nothing left. The process was so slow, so insidious, that I didn't even realize I was disappearing. I was just tired, a deep, cellular exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with the psychic weight of being consistently, profoundly, and casually undervalued. So when he stood in our sunlit kitchen and told me, with the unearned confidence of a king, that I would walk away with nothing because I had simply signed what he put in front of me, he wasn't just being cruel. He was stating, with perfect clarity, how he saw me, not as a partner, but as a subordinate, not as a wife, but as a signatory. He had forgotten that the signatory is the most important person in the room, because without her signature, the contract is just a piece of paper. And he had forgotten one other crucial thing. He had forgotten what that first, most important contract actually said. The breaking point wasn't a moment of anger. It was a moment of profound and sudden stillness. It happened in my office, under the cool white light of my desk lamp, with the navy blue binder open in front of me. My own lawyer, a calm and methodical woman named Alana, had asked for a copy of the prenup to begin the filing process. "Just so we know the baseline we're working from," she'd said. I had retrieved the binder from the back of our filing cabinet, from a folder marked Personal, Important. It felt like an artifact from another lifetime. Darren and I had been so young. I was 27, just starting to make a name for myself in contract management. He was 29, full of dreams about his future company. The prenup had been my idea. It wasn't about a lack of love. For me, it was the opposite. It was an act of love. It was defining our terms in the light so we wouldn't lose our way in the dark. It was the first contract we would build together. He had resisted, of course. He'd found it unromantic, a sign that I was already planning for failure. "It feels like you don't trust me," he'd said. "It's not about trust, Darren," I had explained patiently over and over. "It's about clarity. It's about protecting both of us. It's about being professional about our life together, just like we're professional about our careers." Eventually, he'd agreed, but with a dismissive air. He treated the process like an annoyance, a box to be checked to humor his difficult, detail-oriented fiancé. His lawyer was a golf buddy who gave the document a cursory glance. My lawyer, however, was thorough, and I was her most demanding client. I remembered the arguments. I remembered one clause in particular. Darren wanted a simple statement that all assets acquired during the marriage would be considered marital property, to be split 50-50. I had insisted on a distinction. My salary, my retirement accounts, my investments, those were mine. His future business, that was his. But then I added a sub-clause, a piece of language I had to fight for, one that caused a week of tense silence between us. The clause stipulated that if I were to contribute substantive, uncompensated professional services to his business, documented in writing, that contribution would be valued at a fair market rate upon dissolution of the marriage, and that value would be considered my separate property, exempt from the 50-50 split of the business's other assets. He had called it absurd. "What are you talking about? Uncompensated professional services? You're my wife. Of course you'll help me." "Helping is one thing, Darren," I'd said, my voice steady. "Working is another. If I'm going to be your unpaid consultant, your unpaid lawyer, then that labor has value. This clause just acknowledges it." He'd finally relented, rolling his eyes. "Fine. Whatever you want, Imani. Put your crazy little paragraph in there. It's never going to matter." It's never going to matter. Now, 12 years later, I was staring at that clause. Section 4, subsection C. My neat, determined handwriting was in the margin, a small star next to the paragraph number, and underneath it, in my files, I had the documentation. 12 years of emails with the subject line, "Quick Look." 12 years of revised contracts saved as PDFs. 12 years of tracked changes in Word documents. I hadn't done it consciously, not as a weapon. I was just organized. It was how my brain worked. I saved everything. I had, without realizing it, been documenting my uncompensated labor for over a decade. The sensation that washed over me was not rage or triumph. It was a cold, quiet click. It was the sound of a lock finding its key. It was the feeling a systems engineer must get when a diagnostic test reveals the single, primary point of failure in a complex machine. The entire chaotic, painful, emotional mess of the last few years suddenly resolved itself into a simple, procedural matter. The conflict wasn't about his feelings versus my feelings. It was about the enforceability of a signed agreement. He had said, "You signed what I put in front of you." The devastating truth, which he had completely forgotten, was the reverse. He had signed what I put in front of him, and he had dismissed it as meaningless. In my world, the world of contracts, there is no greater mistake than to dismiss the fine print. The fine print is where reality lives, and the reality of Section 4, subsection C, was about to become the most important part of his life. My past self, the determined, clear-eyed 27-year-old woman who insisted on her own value, had reached across time and handed me the tool I needed to save myself. I felt a wave of gratitude for her foresight, for her refusal to be dismissed. She had been the guardian of my future, and I had finally caught up with her. I closed the binder. The decision was made. Not with a shout, but with the silent, irreversible finality of a signature on a dotted line. From that moment on, my actions became clean, methodical, and quiet. The emotional storm inside me had passed, leaving behind the calm, focused clarity of a project manager executing a plan. The objective was no longer to save my marriage, or even to understand its failure. The objective was to enforce the contract. I continued to live in the house with Darren for another 2 weeks, a period of surreal, suspended animation. On the surface, nothing changed. I made coffee in the morning. I asked about his day. I performed the mundane choreography of a shared life. But internally, I had already left. I was a ghost in my own home, my presence a temporary illusion while the real me was elsewhere, assembling documents, conferring with my lawyer, and preparing for the next phase. The irony was unbearable. During those 2 weeks, Darren, operating under the assumption of his own dominance, was almost pleasant. He believed he had intimidated me into submission with his "you'll get nothing" speech. He saw my quiet compliance not as the calm before the storm, but as my acceptance of his terms. He was magnanimous in his perceived victory. He'd bring home my favorite takeout or suggest we watch a movie. "See, we can do this amicably," he said one evening, smiling at me over a container of pad thai. "No need for things to get ugly." I just nodded, the words, Section 4, subsection C, a silent mantra in my mind. My preparation was a master class in my own profession. I created a new binder, a clean white one. Inside, I organized everything with numbered tabs. Tab 1 was a pristine copy of the prenuptial agreement. Tab 2 was a chronological log of every project I had worked on for his business, with dates, descriptions, and outcomes. Tab 3 contained the printed emails, the quick look requests that established a documented pattern of him seeking my professional services. Tab 4 held the contracts I had revised, with my redline notes clearly visible. Tab 5 was a conservative valuation of my time, calculated using the average hourly rate for a freelance contracts consultant with my experience, multiplied by the thousands of hours I had logged over 12 years. The final number was staggering. It represented a significant portion of his company's net worth. Each document added was a quiet act of reclamation. Each tab I placed was a validation of the work he had erased. This was not an emotional plea for fairness. It was an invoice. Alana, my lawyer, reviewed the binder with a slow, appreciative smile. "Imani," she said, looking up at me from her conference table, "this is the most thorough file I've ever seen from a client. You've done 90% of my job for me." "It's what I do," I said. It was the first time in years that the phrase felt like a statement of strength, not a complaint. The day of the exit was a Tuesday. It was procedural, not dramatic. There was no packed suitcase in the hallway, no tearful goodbye. My exit was a legal filing. I met Alana at her office and signed the divorce petition. The petition itself was standard, but attached to it, as Exhibit A, was the prenuptial agreement, and as Exhibit B, a summary of the claim under Section 4, subsection C. That evening, I went home. Darren was on a conference call in his study. I walked to the dining room table, the one where we'd signed the contract for our first home. I took the navy blue binder, the original, the artifact of our beginning, and placed it squarely in the center of the polished wood. On top of it, I laid the official, court-stamped copy of the divorce petition. The symbol of it all was the binder itself, the forgotten history, the dismissed terms, now brought back into the light. It was a closed case. I didn't leave a note. The documents spoke for themselves. Then I walked into our bedroom, picked up the small bag I had packed that morning with a few days' worth of clothes, and walked out the front door. I didn't look back. I drove to my sister's house, the engine of my car a low, steady hum. The temperature of my heart was not hot with anger or cold with grief. It was steady. It was the feeling of a process set in motion, of an inevitable outcome finally, formally, beginning. I was not running away. I was complying with the terms of my own release. The first call came 27 minutes after I left. I was sitting on my sister's sofa, a cup of tea warming my hands, when my phone buzzed. Darren's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again and again. A frantic cascade of missed calls, each one a small electronic pulse of his dawning panic. Then the text started. "What the hell is this? Imani, pick up the phone. Is this a joke? Where are you?" My sister Maya came and sat next to me, placing a steadying hand on my arm. She didn't ask what was happening. She had been a witness to the slow erosion for years. She just looked at the buzzing phone and said, with a quiet finality, "It's about time." I did not respond to any of it. My silence was a new kind of power. For 12 years, my role had been to respond, to solve, to manage, to soothe. My silence was the first act of my new life. It was a boundary he could not cross. The next morning, the escalation shifted from shock to anger. The accusations came in a long, rambling email, CCing his lawyer, Marcus. It was a performance of legalistic rage. He called my filing absurdly aggressive and a transparent attempt to extort money from a business you had nothing to do with. He accused me of being manipulative, of plotting this behind his back. He was painting me as the villain, curating a narrative of his own victimhood. I read the email, my face impassive. Then I forwarded it to Alana with a simple note. For the file. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were reviewing a poorly drafted contract from an opposing party. It was full of emotional, unenforceable claims. It was noise. My only direct response came that afternoon. He sent a text message that was a pure distillation of his lawyer's influence. Marcus says this prenup won't hold up in court. It's unconscionable. You are trying to ruin my business. I looked at the message, at the borrowed authority, the performative outrage. I typed a single sentence and sent it. I'm enforcing the agreement we both signed. It was a statement of fact, unemotional, direct, and unassailable. That one sentence seemed to infuriate him more than 1,000 words of anger would have. It refused to engage with his drama. It simply pointed back to the document. The next stage was recruiting allies. He called my parents. He called our mutual friends. He spun a tale of a bitter, vengeful wife who had blindsided him. But my friends, the ones who had seen me leave parties early to review his paperwork, the ones who had listened to my exhaustion, they knew. His efforts backfired. The people who mattered knew my character. They knew I was the last person on earth to be frivolous or dramatic. His frantic campaign to manage the narrative only made him look desperate. Then came the shift to negotiation, the phase I had been expecting. He called, and this time I answered, putting the phone on speaker with Alana on the line, listening silently. His voice was different. The anger was gone, replaced by a strained, conciliatory tone. Imani, look, I think we got off on the wrong foot, he began. This has all gotten out of hand. Let's be reasonable. We don't need to follow that old thing to the letter. Let's just sit down, you and me, and figure out a fair number. The offer was a classic tactic. Attempt to move the negotiation away from the written contract and into the vague emotional realm of fairness, where he believed his charisma could win. I let the silence hang for a moment before I spoke, my voice even and calm. The time for negotiation was 12 years ago, Darren, I said. We negotiated. We have a signed document that reflects the outcome. His frustration flared. You were supposed to be my partner, he said, his voice rising. Partners don't do this to each other. Here it was, the moment to redefine his terms. A partner's name goes on the paperwork, I said quietly. A fact, not an accusation. There was a long pause on his end. I could hear his breathing, ragged and shallow. He had run out of tactics. He had tried shock, anger, allies, and negotiation. All that was left was the raw, unscripted truth. I didn't think you'd actually hold me to it, he finally said, his voice small, stripped of all its bravado. That's not how marriage works. And there it was. The last line he would ever say that mattered. His entire worldview in a single, devastating admission. For him, marriage was a space where his commitments were optional, where love was supposed to supersede his own signature. He believed my love for him was a waiver of my own rights. He didn't understand that for me, the agreement was the structure that made love possible. It was the foundation. He had spent 12 years knocking it down, brick by brick, and was now shocked to find himself standing in the rubble. I didn't argue with him. I didn't lecture him. The revelation was his to live with. The hearing is on the 14th, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Alana will send all communication to Marcus from now on. Then I ended the call. The courtroom was exactly as you'd imagine. Wood-paneled, formal, and emotionally sterile. It was the perfect environment for the end of our marriage, because it was a place where only facts and documents mattered. Darren and his lawyer, Marcus, were at one table. Alana and I were at the other. Darren wouldn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looked smaller in his suit than I had ever seen him, his usual confidence replaced by a brittle, defensive posture. The proceedings were brief, almost anticlimactic. Marcus tried to argue that the prenup was unconscionable, that I had exerted undue influence, that the terms were punitive. He postured and bloviated, but he had no evidence. When it was Alana's turn, she didn't make a passionate speech. She simply walked the judge through the white binder I had prepared. She presented the signed agreement. She showed the judge the emails, the documented requests for my professional services. She presented the valuation. It was a calm, methodical, and devastatingly thorough presentation of evidence. It was a contract review. The judge, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s, listened patiently. She read Section 4, subsection C, aloud. The words echoed in the quiet room. She looked at our signatures on the last page. She looked at Darren. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Did you have legal representation when you signed this document?" "Yes, Your Honor," he mumbled. "And did you read it before you signed it?" He hesitated. Yes. "Then I'm not sure what there is to discuss," the judge said, closing the binder with a soft thud. "The agreement is clear, and it is enforceable. The petition is granted per the terms of the prenuptial contract dated May 14th, 12 years ago." It was over. Just like that. The gavel didn't even bang. It was the quiet, administrative end of a world. Darren's face drained of color. He looked utterly stunned, as if he truly could not comprehend that the words on a piece of paper he'd dismissed years ago could have such a concrete, irreversible power. He had believed the story he told himself, and he could not fathom a reality where his narrative wasn't the one that mattered. He learned in that sterile courtroom that a contract doesn't care about your narrative, it only cares about its own terms. My vindication was not a feeling of triumph. It was a feeling of alignment. It was the quiet satisfaction of a system working as it was designed to. The resolution was simply the execution of the terms. Rebuilding my life was much like building that binder. Methodical, intentional, and based on clear principles. The settlement, which was substantial, was not a windfall. It was back pay. It was the fair market value of 12 years of my uncompensated intellectual labor. I didn't buy a new car or a fancy apartment. The first thing I did was form an LLC. I became the sole proprietor of Imani Harris Consulting. I used my expertise for myself. I found a small sunlit office in a co-working space in Midtown Atlanta and began helping other small business owners, particularly women and people of color, navigate the world of contracts. I helped them protect their intellectual property. I taught them how to draft clauses that secured their cash flow. I showed them how to build the legal and operational infrastructure that would allow their brilliance to flourish safely. My work became my healing. Every client I helped was an act of repairing my own history. Every time I explained the importance of a well-defined scope of work, I was speaking to my younger self. Every time I insisted a client value their own labor, I was validating my own. I built my new life with the same discipline I had once dedicated to Darren's. Agreements were honored. Access was defined. Expectations were put in writing. Nothing was left to assumption. My peace came from this clarity. It was a quiet, sturdy peace, built on a foundation of my own making. About a year later, I saw him. I was at a coffee shop, waiting for a client when he walked in. The bell over the door chimed. I looked up, and there he was. He looked ordinary. The larger-than-life charisma that had once filled every room was gone. He was just a man, looking tired, waiting in line for a latte. Our eyes met. A flicker of panic crossed his face, then resignation. He gave me a small, hesitant nod. On an impulse, I motioned for him to join me. He walked over to my table, holding his coffee in both hands like a shield. "Imani," he said, "you look good. So do you, Darren." We talked for a few minutes about trivial things, the weather, a new restaurant, the awkward, polite chatter of strangers who share a deep and complicated history. There was no anger left in me, no resentment. There was just distance. He was a closed file, a project from a former job. As he got up to leave, he paused. "For what it's worth," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "I get it now. What you did, you were just doing your job. I should have seen that." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was an honest one. It was the closest he could get to admitting the truth. I just nodded. "Take care of yourself, Darren." He walked away, and I turned back to my work. The blueprints for a client's news service agreement spread across my table. He had not ruined me. He had, in his own careless way, liberated me. He had reminded me that my most valuable asset was not my ability to be supportive, but my expertise. And it was an asset I would never again give away for free. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of love and commitment. People think that love exists in the grand gestures, in the poetic declarations, in a space high above the grubby details of life. They think that contracts, agreements, and clearly defined terms are the enemies of romance, that to speak of such things is to admit a failure of trust. I have learned this is untrue. Love is not a feeling that absolves you of your obligations. It is a commitment that is tested in the fine print. It is found in the willingness to honor the terms you set in the daylight, especially when the darkness comes. An agreement is not a plan for failure. It is the architecture of success. It is the shared understanding that allows two people to build something that can withstand the pressures of time and change. For 12 years, I performed my side of the agreement with diligence and care. I was a good and faithful partner. My mistake was in failing to hold the other party to the same standard. I accepted unwritten amendments that slowly eroded the foundation of our initial contract. I allowed my labor to be reclassified from a contribution to an expectation. I let my love become a loophole he could exploit. Leaving was not an act of destruction. It was an act of restoration. It was a return to the original terms. The court did not give me anything. It simply enforced what was already mine, what we had agreed upon when our intentions were clear and our hearts were open. Peace, I've discovered, is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of clarity. It is knowing your own terms and having the courage to enforce them. It is building a life where your signature is not a formality, but a testament to your own sovereign worth. I am the sole author of my own agreements now. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.